Karaten Sawate Amnes. Sorry it's been so long since I've last uploaded. It's been a crazy semester, so I've been doing a lot of homework and I work full-time, so I'm trying to balance things out as best as I can without making myself go too bonkers. So today I wanted to still talk about something classics related, but in the terms of classical reception. One of my favorite things is how the modern world and contemporary people interact with the classics. So today we're going to be talking about lore Olympus. Now, I'm going to be using my notebook because there's quite a few things I wanted to talk about, and I wasn't going to memorize it all before I filmed this video. So, what I wanted to focus on were three main points of the comic. I sat down and I read all 82 of them. I think there was 82 by the time I finished. It updated as I was going through. And I read all of it in about 3 days. So, unlike some people who had to wait weeks for the story to develop, I kind of binged through it. So I didn't have to sit and ponder and think of what was going to happen next. I just continued to read. So I had an advantage in the way of I was able to absorb the story as one cohesive thing within 3 days rather than waiting weeks upon weeks for it to update. So the three main aspects of the comic that I want to talk about is the characterization of the gods and other characters that are in the comic, the story itself as I was reading through, and then some technical things that are more about the writing itself, kind of things I noticed that I picked up as I was going through. So the characterization, the thing that surprised me at first was it seemed like the goddesses in the very beginning were really sexualized, and now I could understand for some of the goddesses that would be an acceptable kind of modern interpretation, but it always bothers me when it's a goddess like Artemis or Hestia, who are meant to be virgin goddesses. I feel like it's odd to have them in an overtly sexual type of clothing or situation, I guess. There was an issue I had with an episode of Supernatural too that depicted Artemis in a really sexual manner that made me feel really weird. That's a whole other topic that I'll get back to eventually. And then, so some of the characters I did seem to like okay. Eros and Hera so far are kind of what I would expect as a modern interpretation, I guess. So my other note says Hermes looks weird, but his personality seems okay. I had trouble figuring out who was who at first. So when they said that Hermes was Hermes in the comic, I had assumed he was Ares, I guess because he was red, but there was nothing else that was particularly obvious that made him Hermes until they said his name. Yeah, that's the next thing I have on here, is that so far, like, I do like the humor of the comic. It's very interesting to me, the way that it's written. It's written pretty well. I like the humor. There are aspects of the writing I don't like, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then the characters seem kind of flat. They're not as well-rounded as I think they could be, but perhaps that's because we're still pretty much getting introduced to a lot of characters, so we're not getting as much from them yet. So I'll hold off on my full, like, critique of the characters being fully well-rounded until there's more in the story. And of course, if it's just these are a bunch of side characters who we don't really see all that often, it makes sense that they wouldn't have more dimension to them. I found the idea, personally, I understand why it happened, but I found the idea of Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon going to a strip club really odd. I guess that makes sense for how they're characterized in mythology, to have that as an equivalent type of place they would go. But the conversation didn't need to happen in a strip club. They literally could have done it anywhere else. So it didn't seem like there was any reason for it to be except for they were in a strip club. Ha ha. I do like that Hades in the comic has additional dogs aside from Cerberus. That is really interesting to me, and I like that he just adopts dogs because he feels like it. That's interesting. I guess it makes sense that Hebe would make alcoholic drinks for Hera as the cupbearer, but she's also a child in this, so I found that odd. But again, she's an immortal, so I guess I might be, just some of it felt off to me, but it's because I'm human, and I think the idea of like an 8-year-old making an alcoholic drink for her mother really strange, and not really something you would want your child to do for you at 8 years old. I don't view that as something horrible per se that breaks the deal for me to read this. I'm still going to read it despite other critiques I'm about to talk about. But just some of it seemed odd, and that's all I'm saying, is that to me it stuck out, and I was like, I don't really see why Hera couldn't just have done it herself and gotten the drink rather than making an 8-year-old child do it. Like, having Hebe as a bartender is a little different than having her as a cupbearer to me. Okay, so the next note I have is about Hecate, and that she seems a little off from how I would imagine her, but I am glad that she yelled at Hades about the age difference between him and Persephone, because he's 2,000 years old and she's actually 19. Just 19. Then she stops aging, so she's only been alive for 19 years. Hades has been around for 2,000 years. I know with immortal beings, that's a different type of relationship, where time doesn't really matter to them in the same way. But as a human, I find that kind of gross. Because, Jesus Christ, that's a big-ass age difference. So the two characterizations that I really am having a hard time grasping is Minth and Thetis. Now, Thetis' characterization in different types of mythologies and other modern retellings that I've read obviously don't always necessarily paint her in a good light. But the way she's acting in Lore Olympus is just really odd to me. It's just so, I don't want to say vile, but it feels vile the way that she talks and acts with Minth. And with Minth it's harder to judge because there's not that much mythology about her, so it's easier to manipulate it without too much criticism. So I feel uncomfortable with certain aspects of the characterization in Lore Olympus that I can look past to a point for me to keep reading, but I don't necessarily agree with every single characterization. And I don't have to. It's not my comic. I don't have to like it. And you don't have to not like it because I don't necessarily like certain aspects of it. I like it overall, but there are problems in it that don't sit well with me. And I'm not saying that none of you can like it, because I know lots of people like Lore Olympus. Thousands and hundreds of thousands of people read it every week. That's great. I'm super glad that the author has that big of a following and that it's making an aspect of classics. It's continuing an aspect of classics in a way of classical reception that's more accessible to some people. But there's some characterization issues for me. For the story, there are parts in the story that really confused me, that there was no exposition for, that made it harder for me to follow the story itself, that had nothing to do with characterization, but had to do with world building and not understanding how certain things worked in this realm. So there's like two major things about the limits of the gods in this realm. So in this world, apparently the gods can get super drunk, and so what were they drinking? Was it ambrosia? Was it mixed with wine? What were they drinking that made Persephone so sloshed that she passed out? That's what I want to know. So the other thing that happens is Persephone cuts herself, and there's blood everywhere. But so what are the limits that the gods have in this world where they can get extremely drunk to the point of passing out, and they can also bleed everywhere to the point where it's a concern of a wound that is a problem, since they are immortal. They've said they are immortal. Hera said that Persephone stopped aging at 19, so she's physically going to be 19 forever. So where is the limits here on how the gods function in this world? The other thing that really confused me is that apparently Olympus is in the modern world, but Earth is ancient Greece? Why? Interesting concept, but why? There's no explanation. There's just, these gods have cell phones and cars and they're driving around and talking to each other. They have computers, but going down to the Earth means you're in ancient Greek clothing and you don't have any of this technology. So I want to know why, and also it's not explained. It's mentioned in number 17, but it's not fully explained until it's in a Q&A. And for me, if you have to explain something in a Q&A, you're not doing very well as a storyteller. There has to be some type of exposition, and there needs to be some type of explanation. If it's just because and the author doesn't want to give any more explanation, that's fine, but I don't think that that's very good writing. If there's not a reason, then you shouldn't do it. There should be a reason behind all of your choices as an author for writing. If there's no reason, then what's the point? So, trigger warning. For those of you who don't read Lore Olympus, I am going to discuss a part of it that includes sexual assault. So if you don't want to hear that, you can skip ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to talk about it now, and I won't be too long, so you're probably a minute or two ahead, unless I go on a rant. Otherwise, I will mention it, how long you need to skip ahead. So, a rape occurs that isn't in mythology. Now, we know that sexual assault is a norm in ancient Greek writing and mythology. So the rape occurrence that happens is between Apollo and Persephone, and I don't understand why it was included, because if it's being used for a plot device, using rape as a plot device is gross and lazy writing. That's all I have to say about that, because from what I've seen, there was no reason for it to be included at all. They could have completely left it out, and there still could have been the same exact story. Apollo could have still been a butthead the whole time without raping Persephone. yes, rape occurs throughout mythology, but this isn't one that I remember from mythology. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I remember, Apollo did not rape Persephone in any myth from the Greek world. So to have that included in something that's supposed to be a modern take or retelling or re-envisioning of ancient Greek myth, there's other things you could have done. Literally so many other things. I mean, Apollo could have just been one of those guys who just can't take no, which doesn't always have to end in rape. It often does, especially in the real world, but when I'm reading about not the real world, that's not what I want to hear. And so I had a problem with that. I'm still going to read it to understand where the story is going. I am interested in knowing how things develop, but there was literally no reason to include that at all. Because we all know that in mythology, Apollo does chase people that he's infatuated with to the point where they're like, someone turned me into a tree, so I can escape this guy. Completely different than what happened here. And in my opinion, it didn't need to be included. He could have just been an annoying, I'm gonna chase her because I like her, and I'm friend-zoned or what have you, because there's plenty of male characters out there like that. I don't like them either, but at least they didn't rape the other character, which I can't believe I have to say about anything at all. So my point is, it's included and it didn't need to be. It's lazy and gross, and I don't like that being part of anything I read. Again, because it's something that's already happened, I could probably read more of it, but I do not like that aspect of the comic. That arc did not need to happen. Okay, I'm done talking about that now. Hi, if you skipped ahead, we're back on our regularly rambly takes on these things. I apologize if you missed the warning and you just watched through that. I apologize. I'm gonna make sure I have a warning in the beginning of the video instead. There's a quote in one of the comics that says, "This is why the mortals see us as gods and not monsters." So this brings me back to the question from earlier. They're immortal, but are they actually gods? Is that a thing that's gonna come up, that they're not actually gods, but they are immortal beings who can control things that mortals think of as gods? What's the deal here? I understand that this is part of exposition and it probably won't come up yet, and that's kind of intriguing to me, so that's another reason why I want to keep reading, because are they not gods? Is this just what mortals know them as? That aspect is intriguing in the way of, oh, there's a little thing there that might be true, and if it's just what the author said and there's no, like, payoff for it, that's fine too, but that intrigued me without frustrating me of lack of exposition. So the next thing that kind of confused me is Persephone is in college and needs a scholarship to go. Why? This is another why is this happening? I don't understand. So there's a college or university for gods and mythological creatures, I guess, because she was in class with other creatures who were surprised that she was a goddess or something. So what is it that they're studying? What's Persephone studying in school? And if she's a goddess, why does she need a scholarship? Is this not covered under, like, I'm a god, we have money for this? don't sweat it? Or is it because she's the daughter of Demeter and Demeter's just like, not really, can I pay you in grain? So I don't understand that aspect at all, aside from putting her in a social situation where she's at school. Why? I just don't like to get through 80 pages of a comic and still be going, why? I understand it's a webcomic, so it's gonna take longer to get through for some things, and that's fine. But what is it about the college and the school that's so important? Aside from the fact that she might lose her scholarship because it has to do with being an Eternal Maiden, because of what was mentioned earlier. So, aside from another plot device that's connected to the thing that I think did not need to happen, why? Why is she in school? What is she studying? Why do gods need to study? Shouldn't they just know what they're doing? Do all gods need to study? Did they all have to go to school? Did Zeus have to go to school? Explain to me what it is that's going on with this college/university. What is this? Why? I don't understand why a god needs to go to college. So also in another aspect with the idea of what are the limits of gods, why do gods need to go to college, they also mention gods going to therapy. Now, obviously, if you're in a traumatic experience, a therapy session, or more than one, considering how traumatic these things are a good thing. Again, gods need therapy? So what is it? So, obviously they're humanized to a point, and that's good. A lot of the Greek gods are very human, and that makes sense to me. But who is gonna be this godly therapist that knows, okay, here, let me handle your traumatic experience that's pretty unique to you? Who is the god of therapy in this story? That's what I want to know. Is there a god of therapy that we're not talking about? What is this? So, it's good that she's getting therapy. She should get therapy after what happened. But I didn't know gods could get therapy. That's just another... This is a very human thing for them to be doing. And again, I don't have a problem with this. I was just surprised that that was included. I did like what happened when Eros figures out what happened to Persephone. It was very well drawn and well written. The reveal and him explaining to her, you know, this is still a problem. That was good. And when it comes back up again, it was very well done and depicted in a way that I would imagine rethinking and reliving that trauma is kind of how I would see it in my head too. Because part of the reason I do not like reading things like that is because it happened to me too. I don't want to read about that in my fictional stories. I knew that it happened before I read it because it's one of the complaints I've seen from other people who read it or who have read it. So that was the only thing I really knew about it going into reading it. So aside from, I just think it's gross and lazy writing to make that a plot device, I don't want to have to think about my own trauma when I'm reading something that I'm using as an escape from the real world. Escapism doesn't work if it's reflecting the real world too much back at me, which is part of why I have a problem with it. So we're gonna move on. We did the characterization, we did the story, and now we're gonna get to the more technical parts that I had a few notes about. So for the writing, This isn't a big deal because, again, it's a webcomic, and I'm sure if the author goes back, she'll see all of the things that I'm mentioning and probably fix them. But two things that bothered me, that's not a really big deal. It's, you know, everyone's human and it happens, but there are some typos to the point where it's a character that's been mentioned multiple times, but the person's name is spelled differently, like, several times. Not that the person is never spelled the same way, because that would be a big problem, but there are several times where a certain character or characters have their name spelled a certain way, and then the next time I see it, it's like another way. I think the most that I saw was like one character was spelled 3 different ways, and I was like, so to be sure, I was like, okay, maybe it's a different character, because sometimes Greek names are very close to each other to the point where maybe I just messed up and misread. Otherwise, there are some copy editing issues because the person was spelled, their name was spelled different a couple times. And then the other thing was, it's kind of hard to follow when you're reading the way that the page is set up for Lore Olympus. It's difficult to figure out who is speaking at certain points. So I kind of had to reread pages more than once to figure out, okay, who's saying what as we're going through. And honestly, I would have gone faster if there was a way to tell better who was speaking or who the narrator was. Otherwise, it was kind of difficult to figure out who was saying what they were saying. And some points I just gave up, and I was like, I'm never gonna figure out who's supposed to be speaking at this point, so I'm just gonna continue on. I'm going back to talking about the assault, so if you want to skip ahead, go ahead. The imagery that's given and the continuous interactions with the perpetrator, Apollo, is very well done. Again, I don't particularly like interacting with media that depicts this, but I think that the way that it's portrayed with the aftermath and the continuous interactions with Apollo, the imagery is very well done for that. And so I don't like it altogether, but that imagery and that reaction and the things that happened after is very realistic. So I will give it that. But again, I don't want it to be realistic. So it's good in the way that it is realistic, but I would prefer that not to be in the media I consume. So, as long as this type of thing does not happen again in Lore Olympus, I will probably keep reading it, because I knew it before I was going into it. But if something like this happens again, I will probably stop reading it, because I can't deal with media that makes that such a big plot device and shows it. And the last bit isn't necessarily the author's fault. It honestly is probably my fault for having such a bad internet connection, so technically it's my internet's fault. But some of the pages loaded so slowly on Webtoons that it made it so I had to scroll up and scroll down very slowly to make sure the entire page was loaded before I scrolled all the way back up again to actually read it. Because the format of Lore Olympus is such that sometimes you can't actually tell if it's fully loaded or not. There are probably a couple pages where there was like a panel that hadn't loaded fully yet, that I had to go back and read it all again because it hadn't loaded till I was all the way at the end of the page. And I was like, this seems a little weird, like there's something missing. And there was, because the page loaded so slowly. So again, my overall take on Lore Olympus is, it's interesting. It's a unique take on the Greek gods. I'm really bothered by the assault being used as a plot device. I am confused about the world building. So hopefully that becomes more clear eventually. And otherwise, I'm going to stick to some other comics are up for Underworld. It's the same kind of concept. It's a Hades and Persephone story. I prefer that art style over Lore Olympus. Lore Olympus has a very unique art style, and that's really cool. Not necessarily my type of art, but I do like that it's that unique. If you see that artist's work, you'll know who it is, and that's a good thing. However, it's not the kind of aesthetic I usually gravitate towards. So I want to keep reading Lore Olympus to see where it goes. So this is my opinion on it. You don't have to agree with me. You can completely disagree. I'm not saying that the author is horrible or anything. This is just my opinions that I formed as I was reading it. If you've never read Lore Olympus and you're not bothered by certain things in the media that I mentioned throughout this video, I would suggest you go read it and you form your own opinions, because it is a unique story. It's not something I've seen done before in that way, so it would be worth you going and reading it and figuring out if you like it for yourself. And if you go and read it and you completely disagree with me, that's fine, but you went and read it, so it's all, this is just my opinion. So to clarify, I'm not coming for the author. I'm not saying that this is the most horrible thing I've ever read. I'm giving a critique that has to do with my personal feelings on certain aspects of the way that it is portrayed in the comic. Overall, interesting story, interesting concept. I'd like to know more. The finer points you just watched. So I hope all of you have a great week. I hope you guys have a great day, night, whatever. And I will see you soon for another video. Probably in 2 weeks, hopefully sooner than that, since Halloween is coming up. And because Pride is in October in Las Vegas. I have a specific video I was going to make for that, but my package took forever to get here. So, hopefully I have that out on Halloween or right after Halloween, because Las Vegas is hot. So Pride Month in Las Vegas is celebrated in October, so we don't all pass out from heat stroke. So my next video has to do with Pride, and yes, the Thyrsus will make a comeback. Not that it's not already in my video, but it's going to complete a look. Let's just say that.